Summer surprised us, coming over the Starnbergersee with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. Bin keine Russin, stamm aus Litauen, echt deutsch. And when we were children staying at the archduke's, my cousins, he took me out on a sled and I was frightened. He said, Marie, Marie, hold on tight. And down we went. In the mountains, there you feel free. I read much of the night and go south in the winter.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we're taking a look at T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland.
It's an interesting way to round out our group of three works that are all interested in language one way or the other.
Yeah, and different languages rubbing up against each other. This is the first time that we're looking at someone who isn't using constructed languages in this section. So we'll get to see what it's like if you just stick to, previously existing natural languages.
He's more of a scavenger of languages here.
That is one way of putting it, absolutely. Also, happy birthday, The Wasteland.
Happy birthday.
Turning 100 this year, assuming this episode actually makes it out in 2022. But that's when we're recording it, and that's when it's going to count.
Well, that's kind of like one of the really cool paradoxical things about this poem, right? Is that its identity is all bound up in being modern, right? It's an icon of modernist poetry in ways that we might talk about later. It presented itself as marking a turning point in all different kinds of ways, and it's become ossified into anthologies representing that turning point. And it's 100 years old now, so it's like, how modern can you be, right? So thinking about time and where it sits, I think, is a really productive thing to do with this poem.
Yeah, I think you bring up a very good point about the idea of modern and the sense of this poem as being sort of edgy and presenting something new. It's still kind of taught that way and still thought about that way, despite it being 100 years old.
Totally.
And I think a lot of things around modernism function that way. But we'll get to that, I suppose. Before we start, I want to say some news for everybody. As you know, and we don't talk about it too often here, but as you probably know, listener, this network is supported by listeners like you through our Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/megaphonic. And you can sign up there and support us for just a few dollars a month. And that would be lovely. And if you do, you'll get a special bonus treat that we just recorded. A bunch of us from the network on various shows, including me, but not including Suzanne, because she couldn't get suckered into this sort of thing, decided to watch an old movie and talk about it. And for various reasons that I won't get into here, the movie we talked about is the 1965 star-studded biblical epic, The Greatest Story Ever Told. Spoiler alert, it's not a good movie. Anyway, we had a nice long conversation about it. It was me and some of our friends from the Tolkien podcast By the Bywater and a few other of the Megaphonic regulars, and that'll be available for anyone who helps us out on Patreon as well. You'll get access to our friendly, small little Discord where we talk about movies and books and all sorts of things. So
the Discord looks really fun. Yes,
you're just dipping your toes into Discord.
I am. I'm being trained in the use of Discord, and that's going to be one of the fun things for the new year.
Exactly. So come hang out with us. It just costs a few dollars a month if you want to do that. And we thank you very much for helping us make this show. Okay. All that said, let's talk about T.S. Eliot.
Now, how do you feel about this poem? Like, everybody has either voluntarily or involuntarily read this poem. If you were a humanities major at any point, or you took English literature survey classes, you've seen it. So when did you bump into it, and how did it strike you?
Okay. I bumped into it when I was an undergrad, and I was taking some poetry classes, and I think I particularly was taking a modernism in poetry class. The professor was kind of amazing in that terrible way that professors sometimes can be, where he just lectured and wanted to hear the sound of his own voice. But he also knew a lot about the material, specifically about modernism in its most familiar forms, I think. And so I was all for it. I was happy to hear him talk for an hour, a couple times a week, all about T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound and whoever else was involved. A lot of the students found it incredibly boring, but I didn't. I think that was around the first time I read The Wasteland, though I certainly knew of its reputation, and I knew of other Eliot poems, or at least I'm pretty sure I had read Prufrock by then. And I don't remember what I thought of The Wasteland, except that it clearly was an important and well respected. It was a very canonical poem.
Mm-hmm.
And at least at the time, I tried to treat that reverently. I tried to assume, okay, this is a poem that if I put a lot of work into it, it will give me a lot back. And maybe.
Well, you were building your vocabulary of poems, right? Like I remember we've talked in the past about the first time we'd read this or that, and you've talked really movingly sometimes about those first encounters. So that's a phase, right, where you're like building out the vocabulary of poems almost.
Yeah, but I feel like other poems, even other of Eliot's poems, sort of gave me more back than this one. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to sound too negative. There are moments in this poem that absolutely stuck with me, and yet I guess I kind of wondered whether this was the direction I was interested in pursuing poetry.
Do you mean like the experimental and the puzzle-like quality of it, or do you mean something about the oral or audible aspects of it?
I mean the puzzle-like quality. The experimental I was fine with, but the fact that this was an experiment that seemed like it demanded an answer and that you had to solve for that answer, and it required bringing to bear upon the poem the entirety of Western civilization as T.S. Eliot understood it, right? Like that lost its appeal, or rather, I didn't feel like I was getting enough out of the poem to merit that. Though there, again, I don't want to overstate like my dislike of the poem or anything. It's just that there were other poems, even other obscure poems from like the modernist period, that I found a lot more rewarding.
By other poets from the period, you mean?
Sometimes by other poets, Ezra Pound's work, similar comparable work of his, Hugh Selwyn Mauberley, is a lot better, at least for me, than this poem is in terms of satisfying and in terms of giving me an aesthetic experience that I get excited about. Even like the early sections of the cantos of his are also just, the language ravishes me more than the Wastelands language does.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's still plenty of that I like in The Wasteland, but I don't think about it as much as I think about some of the other poems that are associated with it. What about you?
I had somewhat of a similar experience in that I too, I think, ran into some of his other poems before I ran into The Wasteland. Definitely Prufrock and The Hollow Men, both of which I was really drawn to. And I think we may talk about the oral sound qualities of his writing, and those are very much on display in those two poems. And I was really became enchanted with those. I think somebody gave me, either when I'd first gone to college or just before I went, a collection of his works. And so I'd read those and I was really taken by them. And then, must have been a couple years into college, the first time I bounced off The Wasteland, but then I read it and I got captivated by what we were talking about just a moment ago, those puzzle-like qualities. The fact that it has annotations on it, that is not just the annotations a later critic might put on, but Eliot's own footnotes, like he's footnoted his own poem, and I've been really enchanted by that. I'm like, what is that? And the fact that it was, it seemed like you said, a puzzle you could solve if you just spent enough time thinking about it. And as a young person, right, I was really a young reader, right? I was taken in by that. I was really enchanted by that. And looking at it now, so many years later, I've looked at it now and then over the years, right? But looking at it again now, reading it now as a much older reader, I still am enchanted by orality in his poetry, the what it does to your ear, the almost, I don't know how to put this, enfleshed quality of the way it invites you to speak the lines. And that's something I think maybe it'd be fun to talk about. But I'm also kind of like, like the Western Civ thing it's doing, the very creepy retro, Jesse Weston thing that's happening there. I'm like, oh, wow, that was a really unfortunate moment in intellectual history.
Can you explain Jesse Weston?
Well, I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but basically there was some literature that was popular in the early part of the 20th century that was sort of about unpacking the underlying mythos that would sort of explain everything about literature, history, and theology, particularly Christian theology, all in this one mythic framework. And it struck me as a bit silly even the first time I ran across it, but people seem to have taken it very seriously in the 20s and 30s for whatever reason.
Right. It was a kind of a totalizing structure where it was like, this is the key to all mythologies,
exactly.
as Casaubon would say, yes.
Exactly. And it's just icky. So that's kind of there, But like I said, there's still these very beautiful moments, and those attract me and enchant me as much as they ever did.
Okay, T.S. Eliot, who is this guy and why did he write this poem?
I'll just say a few things about him. So Thomas Stearns Eliot, born in 1888, died in 1965. He wrote essays, plays, criticism. And it's his poetry, though, that really makes him famous. We mentioned earlier, he's a major figure in modernist poetry. And we've talked before about modernism as a literary movement, like when we talked about Joyce's Ulysses or Virginia Woolf. But that was the context of modernist prose. And so Eliot is kind of the counterpart to them in a sense, when we think about the history of poetry. He did other things to make a living. He was an editor, and also early in life, his day job was working in a bank. So he kind of had to really claw his way into a successful literary career. He was born in the U.S., but spent most of his life in England, and this is something that he clearly felt really strongly about. He moved there as a young man, age 25, and he became a British citizen a little later on when he was 39 years old. And this is back when you had to renounce your old citizenship, so he clearly wanted to, that's a way of life he wanted to adopt for himself. We've mentioned already a couple of his best-known poems. The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, which made him famous, came out in 1915. The Wasteland, which came out 7 years later in 1922, just a few years after World War I, and that's probably an important context we might talk about. The Hollow Men, another really famous poem of his, came out in 1925. And he's also known for Ash Wednesday and the Four Quartets. And we might talk about those later, especially if you have any interest in them. They're really where he gets deeply into the place of Christian theology within poetry. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1948, and ironically, I noticed that he was actually living here, where I am living, at the Institute for Advanced Study, when he got the Nobel Prize. He was visiting for a little while when J. Robert Oppenheimer was the director of the Institute. And since they were both very heavy into Sanskrit literature, I assume they talked about this when they were here. And he wrote a play when he was here. He wrote The Cocktail Party, which is really not very good, but, whatever. So, yeah, he strikes me as somebody whose poetic production early in life, I find it more interesting than his poetic production later. And I think it's that material that's more canonical. Like the stuff that shows up in the anthologies all the time, I think it is mostly that earlier poetry. Like that's the stuff that's been canonized.
Yeah, I think Prufrock is just very easy to like. It's one of those poems that is kind of a hit with a certain type of undergrad, perhaps. It is about somebody who is quite young, but who imagines himself to be quite old.
Yeah.
And who worries about eating a peach because it might cause him indigestion and is anxious about whether he can get laid and things like that. And it's just very mopey in a way that I and many other people could have sympathized with in their, late teens, early 20s.
Yeah. But already there's that beautiful oral quality. I'm going to read a few lines of it just because to give a little bit of the sense of how it hits your ear. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in the drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. And indeed there will be time for the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. There will be time to murder and create, and time for all the works and days of hands that lift and drop a question on your plate. Time for you and time for me, and time yet for 100 indecisions, and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. I like that. that.
Yeah. I'm not saying that I don't still have a part of me sympathize with this or anything, or maybe a large part of me, but there is something where that I find is keenly felt in early adolescence.
Yeah, the meaning is stupid, but I just still caught up by like the sound, right? And it's interesting because it's kind of free verse and it's kind of structured verse. This is the earlier work of his, the Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, but in The Wasteland, it's the same thing where you get lines and lines that kind of look like they're not in any particular poetic form, but you press on them a little bit and they're either iambic pentameter or there's some anapaests there. Like they're making music, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, he's got iambic pentameter deeply ingrained in him and he can't seem to escape it, even if he tries to hide it, or even if Ezra Pound, who edited The Wasteland, tries to help him obscure it in some places. That sort of majesty, that sort of dignity, let's say, of iambic pentameter in English, we hear it as a very stately kind of meter and rhythm, and he loves being stately.
Yeah, and that's why, so for example, if people are thinking about what's a frame of reference for iambic pentameter, like if you listen to a Shakespeare play, right, the fancy people speak in iambic pentameter, and the lower class people will speak usually in a not verse structured prose. right? And there's some exceptions, but by and large, that's how it works. So your ear kind of forms an impression of what these people are like. And Eliot, his default was clearly to write in this more formal way. But Pound, his friend, colleague, editor Ezra Pound, to whom he dedicated The Wasteland, you were just mentioning he had edited the poem and he cut a ton of it out. And he gave it this fragmentary quality, which paradoxically makes you see the formal parts in stark relief. You know what I mean? By chopping away some of the polish, he made it shine more, which is super interesting.
Yeah. And in addition to just iambic pentameter, Eliot is also really interested in some other rhetorical features, including particular uses of repetition. And there's a little bit of rhyme in Prufrock, and I guess maybe a little bit in Wasteland, but it's not a rhymed poem by any stretch. But he's thinking about that kind of assonance and echoing effect of rhyme. So, time yet for 100 indecisions and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. Like you've got that sound repeating and it follows up, and indeed there will be time to wonder, do I dare? And do I dare? Like you repeat that in order to have that nice echoing effect because it is more oratorically profound and pleasing and soothing and gets under our skin in a good way.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And he does that in The Wasteland as well. He does it a little less so when he gets to his later works. I recall the four quartets being about something that I didn't especially care about certain, niceties of theology. And I remember them being very beautifully written, but not trying to do this kind of aggressively sensual stuff that Prufrock and, in a different way, The Wasteland sometimes do with their use of repetition and getting right into a sort of pure sound in poetry.
So, Chris, do you want to do the plot summary?
Well, there's been a war and everything is sad and T.S. Eliot's very sad and maybe Western Civ is falling apart. That's the plot summary.
That is the plot.
It's not a meaningful text to look at the plot of. The poem is grouped into 5 sections overall, each of which is titled, one of which is significantly shorter than the others, which always made me get excited because it's just so disproportionately small. It's just a little guy, that section.
Yeah, it's like 11 lines.
Yeah, and it's called Death by Water, which was very exciting when I was 20 and first reading this.
Yeah.
And it goes through different voices, I guess, and different registers, and that's sort of part of what it's known for. So you'll have a section that, is in a very high register, and then you'll cut to what sounds like, overhearing people at a pub. Mm-hmm. And then you'll cut to echoes of maybe Chaucer or Shakespeare or something else. And then you'll cut to songs in other languages or chants in other languages or things like that. So it's kind of all over the map, structure-wise. I don't know. Do you feel like there's a through line when you read the poem?
I feel like it's very cinematic or like montage, So don't laugh. I mean, it reminds me, Beatles Revolution 9, where it's just all these like montage sound clips. It's like that, right? Where you go from this to this to this, right? And it's just almost you're cutting from this to this and one face passes by and you pick up the other one. That's what it feels like. Here's a little example of a passage that I think gives you a little bit of a sense of this. Unreal city. Under the brown fog of a winter dawn, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many, I had not thought death had undone so many. Sighs, short and infrequent, were exhaled, and each man fixed his eyes before his feet, flowed up the hill and down King William Street, to where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9. There I saw one I knew and stopped him, crying, Stetson, you who were with me in the ships at Mylae, that corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Or has the sudden frost disturbed its bed? Oh, keep the dog far hence that's friend to men, or with his nails he'll dig it up again. You, hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère. It's like, what? So, there's this scene, right? And it evokes men returning from war or commemorating the return from war. There's something of that going on there. And then it becomes kind of personal. I saw one I knew. But then he identifies the other person in terms from a Homeric epic. It's like, what world are we in here? And all the details of this passage just kind of put you off your stride. They just sort of put you off balance into what frame of reference are we in? Are we in, I don't know, are we in 1919? Are we in the ancient world? Where are we? And it just happens over and over again throughout the poem, one way or the other.
Yeah. And, we're getting quotes from various things along the way, although it's bracketed by quotes from Charles Baudelaire, the poet, both Unreal City and that great line that I've always loved about hypocrite lecteur, mon semblable, mon frère, is they're both directly lifted from Baudelaire. It's great. But then we immediately get a quote from Dante or an adaptation of a line from Dante. We get a few other people along the way. It's just, he's drawing on a rich tradition and seemingly expecting you to recognize most of the references that he's putting out there.
And what's really wild is that, there are all these references to all these different pieces of literary history, right? And sometimes he'll actually give you footnotes himself. Eliot will give you footnotes to tell you where it's come from. Many other times, it's left to you, reader, to figure it out, right? But he'll also have these notes that will just give you this random piece of information. So in the passage I just read, there was that line about this church bell, right? Where St. Mary Woolnoth kept the hours with a dead sound on the final stroke of 9, right? And so he gives us a note that says, a phenomenon which I have often noticed. Like, what? What?
Look, he didn't want to write annotations for this poem. He was asked by his publisher, who was publishing the poem as a book, and wanted it to be a little bit longer than the poem itself. And so he was asked to provide some annotations, and he just put some out there. He later expressed some regret about it, apparently, saying that he sort of sent people on a wild goose chase about some of these things. But yeah, they do have a certain delightful character to them because they are so idiosyncratic.
They're incredibly idiosyncratic. Sometimes they send you back to some other passage in the poem, or it's just, and it does two things, right? It underlines that puzzle-like quality that we were talking about earlier, which can be very attractive to a certain kind of reader. But it's also, I don't know, is it also kind of puncturing the gravity of the poem itself? He doesn't seem like someone to, how can I put it, puncture his own gravity, but I could be wrong.
That's a good question. That particular line about, I've heard it. I've heard the fact that the 9th toll from this particular church's bell is a little dull.
I have observed this phenomenon myself. I mean, can you be saying that seriously? Is it possible?
Is it adding verisimilitude to it? Is it? Like, that's a weird choice. I do like that note.
I guess you could say he's inscribing himself within the world of the poem. You could say that, right? And that would be one way of understanding it. That's not just purely silly.
I suppose. And he is sort of absent from the poem. Like there is no authorial I in that sense. It's not a confessional type poem, even in the way that you might understand Prufrock to be one, even though, the title encourages you to think of it as not coming from Eliot himself, but it sure feels like it might. This is definitely a much more sort of third person, even in the sections that are in the first person. It's much more fictive in that way.
Well, that's what I mean by saying before, it's like, it feels like montage, in cinema or in audio, or if you think about like other kinds of art, collage, like it's putting together scraps from different places. There's this, I was going to say famous, I don't know if it's cliched is the right word for it. He says at the very end of the poem, he says, these fragments I have shored against my ruin. And the poem is in fragments, right? And I guess that must have been a really transgressive thing to do 100 years ago, right? And that's interesting and worth thinking about. But how does it read to us now? Like, how does this idea of a thing that is at once a pile of fragments and a whole, and by a whole, I mean not just one poem, but I mean a poem that has become an anchor, like a heavy, weighty anchor in the canon of English literary history. And it clearly set out to do that too, right? Eliot clearly set out to do that. He starts out the poem, April is the cruelest month, right? In a very self-conscious callback to the beginning of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So he's clearly like, I am doing canonical literature is clearly the move, right?
Oh, yeah.
So this dance between fragmentation and wholeness seems to me both really intentional. And also, I'm not even sure, how does that read to us in this present moment? Like, how does that look from this vantage point 100 years later?
I mean, I can only speak for myself. It reads desperate.
Mm-hmm.
He's bringing so much to prove how canonical this poem is by quoting all sorts of people. It's much more exciting to me when he brings in things that are different, such as that observation about the clock. Or, originally in the draft version, the poem was entitled, He Do the Police in Different Voices, which is a great title.
A fantastic title.
It's a quote from a Dickens novel about somebody reading the paper very well by doing the doing different voices for all the different police, etc. And it really catches some of the, collage feeling, the different voices coming through.
And that orality thing that I was talking about is the most attractive feature, I think, at least for me.
Yeah, and I don't know. Some of my favorite parts of the poem are where he takes these sort of low-brow people and gives them voices and puts them in this context, right?
Like the pub scene?
Like the pub scene, which I've always loved.
Yeah, that's very cool, isn't it? Read a little bit of it if you like.
So let's see. When Lil's husband got demobbed, I said, I didn't mince my words. I said to her myself, hurry up, please, it's time. Now Albert's coming back. Make yourself a bit smart. He'll want to know what you done with the money he gave you to get yourself some teeth. He did, I was there. You have them all out, Lil, and get a nice set. He said, I swear, I can't bear to look at you. And no more can't I said. And think of poor Albert. He's been in the army 4 years. He wants a good time. And if you don't give it to him, there's others will, I said. Oh, is there, she said. Something of that, I said. Then I'll know who to thank, she said, and give me a straight look. Hurry up, please, it's time. And it just goes on like this where,
Yeah, it's awesome.
It's really lovely. I love the echoing refrain of hurry up, please, it's time as the bar is closing. But also, it does carry that weight of our civilization is coming to an end. Ha, ha, ha. I think that's actually one of the more effective moments like that.
And it's one of those great juxtaposition moments too, right? As you get to the end of that passage, hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. Good night, Bill. Good night, Luke. Good night, Meg. Good night. Ta-ta. Good night. Good night. Good night, ladies. Good night, sweet ladies. Good night. Good night. And that's the end of it. And it's also a quote from Hamlet.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's this fancy cross reference, but also to a scene that is full of darkness and closure and disaster, right? Like everything is going downhill, right? When we see Ophelia for the last time. So how about the languages? What is going on here with the use of these different languages? Like when we first start the poem, it begins with giving us different languages. Like the epigraph is not merely in a different language, it's in Latin, but then it's got another foreign language nestled inside of it. There's a Greek quotation inside the Latin epigraph. And then when he dedicates it to Pound in the next line, doesn't do that in English either. He does that in Italian in a quotation from Dante.
He does it in both. It's for Ezra Pound, Il Meglio Fabbro, right? The greater craftsman, or however you want to translate that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think again, it's a little try hard, although I like this one more because again, he's bringing a bunch of different resources to bear on this poem to make it more important, to make it more monumental. And so we begin with Latin, which is about as monumental as you can get. And then the Latin quotes Greek. Mm-hmm. And it is a quote from, what's it a quote from again?
I will tell you, it is a quote from the Satyricon of Petronius.
Yes, it's a quote from the Satyricon of Petronius.
And it's also really cool because one of the things that's kind of cool about that passage is it says, translated, it says, for once I myself saw with my own eyes the Sibyl at Cumae hanging in a cage. And when the boy said to her, Sibyl, what do you want? She replied, I want to die.
Yeah.
And the quotations are the boys saying, Sibyl, what do you want? And her saying, I want to die. And so like the Greek is kind of almost like inside the Latin, almost like the Sibyl is in the cage. Get it? I mean, I think that's one of the things that's going on in that passage.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, it's also doing the voices, right? The voices are in a very different register than the outside text.
Yeah, yeah. Which is actually kind of cool. You have to give them credit. It's pretty cool.
Oh, no, I love the epigraph. I mean, there are things about this that I like, and the epigraph and the dedication are definitely among them.
Mm-hmm. So there's like a whole bunch of languages in here. So there's the Latin, the Greek, the Italian right there, the German shows up, and French, and then finally in the last section, Sanskrit.
Yes, which was probably when I first heard of Sanskrit, I have to admit.
I think for me too, as a teenager reading this.
Yeah, and so I had to sort of learn academically why Sanskrit was as monumental as Latin or Greek, if not more so, when I was reading this. And so it's kind of a weird way to get introduced to Sanskrit, right? Like, oh yeah, Sanskrit. It's that language you might go to if you're really reaching hard to monumentalize your modernist poem.
And as the pinnacle of quote unquote Western civilization, right? For, that was the ways in which Sanskrit was being understood in the early part of the 20th century, and especially in North American settings, right? It was being understood as kind of part of a philology that focused on the Indo-European structures of language and understood Sanskrit as an important part of the story that would flower, as it were, in the story of English.
Exactly. And it focuses on 3 Sanskrit words, which are spoken by the thunder, it tells us. again, sort of playing into that, thunder is speaking the Sanskrit, and the words mean, give, sympathize, control, according to Eliot's note.
In the last section.
Yeah, in the last section of the poem, it's part of the build-up to the end of the poem. And it's interesting. The fable of the meaning of the thunder is found in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. That's it. He doesn't tell us what the meaning is. You go to that Upanishad if you want to know more.
He does tell you where to find the German translation.
Yes, very conveniently. If you want a translation, if you need a translation from the Sanskrit, there's a German translation you can go to. Oh, boy.
It's like, thanks for that guy.
I don't know if those specific meanings of those words are doing much here rather than just having the reference and words that are clearly foreign, words that are clearly Sanskrit.
Yeah, I think it has to do with that play of like fragmentation and wholeness. Like one of the things that happens in that last section is we kind of rush into this piling on of fragments in those last 10 lines or so of the poem, right? Where there's all these different languages being clustered together. And that line that we mentioned a little bit earlier, these fragments I have shored against my ruins, shows up, right? That piling up is happening. And then the counterweight to it, I feel like, are these syllables spoken by the thunder, right? This is idea of language as natural language coming out of the natural world. I will not comment on the creepy Orientalism of that. You know, that's the balance against the degenerate, plural, multiple, multilingual detritus that is Western civilization after World War I, or the Great War, I should say, right? Which was understood as a singular event, a transformative singular event, in a way that ceased to be true a few decades later.
It's an interesting moment to compare with something that happens much earlier in the poem, about halfway through, I suppose, where we get some bird song. We get twit, 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 jug, 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 so rudely forced, ta-da, which is meant to be like a nightingale cry. And I don't know, I do like that. I do like that moment, but it is interesting how that breakdown doesn't seem to require Sanskrit.
Yeah.
And yet it still sort of takes us out of language or into a different kind of reckoning with language for a while as we get sort of pure onomatopoeia for a moment. Although I guess it is still mediated. I know the Terrell might be a quote. I don't know if the twit, twit, twit or the jug, 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 jug are quotes from anything.
Well, those are meant to be like bird song, right? So it's all about the Philomela legend here, right?
Yeah. Are those specific transcriptions of the bird song from the Philomela legend?
From the notes on the version I'm looking at, apparently there's a quotation from John Lilly's Alexander and Campaspe from 1564, which has a line that says, "Oh, 'tis the ravished nightingale, jug, 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 teru," she cries. So that's Philomela speaking. So it's almost like I don't know what to call it, degenerated or slightly fragmented version of that quotation, I guess, from Lilly.
Right.
But Eliot does not tell us that. He leaves it for us to figure out whether that's just fragmented language or whether it's coming from somewhere. It's like unrecognizable detritus, kind of.
Well, and now he also turns me into a paranoid reader, right?
Yeah.
Which may or may not be part of his purpose, but like I look at that and I want to just enjoy it for the bird sound and the sort of loveliness of thinking about twit, twit, twit versus jug, 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 jug. Like those are really nice contrasting sounds to put against each other in a poem. I love it. But
they're natural language too, right? Like thunder. I mean, those are examples. If you look at, just to get all medievalist for a minute, when you look at like commentaries on Priscian and stuff, when they talk about how sound can signify, they always use animal sounds and sounds in nature, such as thunder, as examples of different kinds of non-intelligible speech, so to speak. So it's kind of a similar move to the thunder move in that sense.
Absolutely. But my point was that I feel paranoid about, should I know where twit, 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 jug, jug, jug comes from? Like I can't just enjoy the sound of it. I can't just be in this moment with this line. I have to think, oh, wait, is this a quote from something? Is that doing something? Am I expected to put this all together? Right? Like it puts a sort of duty on me as a reader that I don't always want. And yet I find it very hard with The Wasteland in particular to shake that. And that's what I don't like about it.
Yeah. No, it is weird the way that in which, sometimes you get a direct quotation, you know exactly where you are. Sometimes you get kind of a sideways quotation where either it's got content that lets you know that he's paraphrasing Dante or whatever, or is a turn of phrase where you know he's alluding to someone else. Like, for example, there's a couple of lines that start out, "but at my back," and then there's it goes on. And that, if you've read Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, right, you immediately go, oh, your head jerks. It's like, oh, it's Marvell, right? And then there's other ones that are so fragmented and so partial that you kind of get them, kind of don't get them. Like, I think he's purposely leaving you those in between places. There's a nice example of this at the end of the third part, where just before we get to that little brief death by water section that you mentioned earlier, just before we get there, we get an account of the river Thames. It goes like this. Trams and dusty trees, Highbury bore me, Richmond and Kew undid me. By Richmond I raised my knees, supine on the floor of a narrow canoe. My feet are at Moorgate, and my heart under my feet. After the event he wept, he promised a new start. I made no comment. What should I resent? On Margate sounds I can connect nothing with nothing. The broken fingernails of dirty hands. My people, humble people who expect nothing. La, la. To Carthage then I came. Burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out. O Lord, thou pluckest. Burning. Right? It's like, what? But so again, it's that conversational montage thing that's going on, and this onomatopoeic speech, this la la, right? And then all of a sudden it's Augustine, right? And we're on the river, but we're also burning, right? And so it's sort of building up to this almost apocalyptic kind of ending, right? Where we go from the fire sermon to the death by water to the thunder. So I guess what I'm saying is that I agree with you about the paranoia he instills in the reader, and that's probably very purposeful. But there's also this weird sense where language is intelligible and almost not intelligible. Like it's along that spectrum. And the multiple English, we've talked about the multiple languages in here, but there's also multiple Englishes. Like there's high register and low registers. We talked about that in the pub scene. There's Elizabethan English, which you get a couple of lines of, especially at the very end of the poem. There's these sing-songy nursery rhyme moments like London Bridge or whatever. There's song lyrics from the period, from the 20s. Those function in a way that's similar to the different languages, but I think also different because they're all within the one linguistic river, I guess, of English. I don't know. What did you make of those? Because you said you were really attracted to the when the nonsense syllables would appear and trying to get a sense of what work they were doing in the poem.
Yeah, I find them interesting. I enjoy when how shall I put this? I enjoy when he's bringing in other registers of English or other histories of English that disrupt his iambic pentameter chanting or inform it differently, like in the pub scene, which I think largely is still an iambic pentameter or, has that in the background, but is not stately. It's not carrying itself like iambic pentameter. And so similarly, when the Shakespearean rag shows up, you get a very different rhythm for a few moments. And I love those moments because I keep wanting it to break out of the shackles of iambic pentameter and the traditions of stately English poetry. I guess that's mostly what I enjoy about them, is that they bring something different to the table. They're T.S. Eliot, perhaps out of his element in an interesting and compelling way. And I think he does his best work then. It's tricky because I haven't fully studied this poem in the sense that I know that you can see they've published early drafts of it that show exactly what Pound did to trim this and re-edit this down to size to the form that we know now. And I generally like Pound's ear, even when he's in a more high flute and stately mode. I like his ear quite a lot. Not everything about him I like, but I like his ear quite a lot.
Yeah,
and so I don't know how much of that is his ear bursting through a bit more than Eliot's ear, so to speak.
That's a good point.
And maybe that's just the parts of those that compel me. I know that Eliot came to this poem wanting to do a lot more register work, obviously, from the title, from the original title. He do the policeman in different voices. He's trying to bring in different lower registers into this work. But yeah, I don't know. That's what I like about those sections, I guess.
Yeah. When you were describing them, I kept thinking back to our conversation about James Joyce's Ulysses and how we talked about different registers of language there as well. And I was wondering if that was in your mind as well.
It wasn't, but now that you say it, you're absolutely right. I think that Joyce is Joyce is working in a much larger palette because he's giving himself 800-something pages. And so he's able to go deeper into his explorations of these voices and what can be done with them. And also he's able to do a lot more different things, right? This is much more compact, and sometimes we only get 2 or 3 lines of a particular register before we're off to the other one because, again, the poem is only 400 something lines long. So that's what you can do in that space. It can be just as effective, but I'm not necessarily interested in doing a straight-on comparison. But I think Joyce does get a bit more out of it than Eliot does here.
I guess I was thinking about it because I was wondering about this whole question of like vocal registers. Like we've read Dickens before, for example, and there you see different kinds of like people speak in different ways, and we talked a lot about how I don't know in Great Expectations how Joe talks and stuff, like how the way they speak tells you something about who they are, and there's lots of other examples of that. But in the novel, you kind of can control it in the sense that you associate a way of speaking with a character. And if a character speaks in a way that's different from the way they usually speak, you notice it and it really sticks out. In a poem like this, where it's just, a montage basically of ways of speaking, it functions so differently because you don't have character to anchor you, which I find both bewildering and kind of pleasurable.
I mean, I'm also very interested in the question of how is Eliot reading Dickens? And how does he read the interplay of those low registers with Dickens's normal voice, which is not an especially high register usually, but not compared with Eliot. But maybe he is reading that as some kind of model. I don't know. I'm sure Eliot wrote something about Dickens at some point, but I have not read deeply into his critical writing. Well, okay, we've talked a bit about this poem and what we like about it, and I've aired my grievances, which I feel like I've put too much emphasis on, but that's okay. I want to talk a little bit about how this poem has been received and how it's been anthologized. Because, as you said, Eliot was clearly trying to make a big deal poem out of this, something canonical, something that would be read amongst the various works that he's citing in the history of the Western literary canon or the European literary canon, or however you want to put it. And spoiler alert, he won. He did that.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? Because clearly he's making that move. That's what I mean by that paradoxical, tentative balance between fragmentation and wholeness, which I think is really important to understanding how it gets to be so important in the anthologies, right? It's a work that's made up of fragments. He's really explicit about that. And yet at the same time, whole, right? And that it's published on its own individually as a kind of singular monumental work, right? In a single volume. Its opening lines, April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring wane. It's very explicitly calling back to the beginning of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, which is in one in April, his shore suta, the drocht of March hath pierced to the root and bathed every vein and switched the core, and so on and so on. Right? So he's purposely calling back to the fountainhead of English literature, right? As Chaucer was sometimes described by early modern poets, and putting himself in that genealogy. And like, that is really a bold move, right? I mean, I say this as someone who has read and appreciated Milton. This is a bold move, and like you said, it works, right? Because it finds his poem finds its way into anthologies as a kind of a counterweight, I guess, as he intended it would do to Chaucer, to other kinds of turning points in English literary history. And because he's responding very explicitly to the effects of the quote unquote Great War, right? It sits there in a really, I don't know how to say, easy way as a poetic marker of that historical turning point. And, so part of it is just circumstances conspire to make this poem stand in that way. But part of it is it's really intentionally set out to inhabit that space, which is interesting. Like when you think about what kind of function that had in, the 20s versus what function it had in the 40s or the 60s or the 80s, or, like to what extent its stature changed, because it never totally went away, at least out from the anthologies, even if it ceased to be an inspiration for working poets.
So I want to tell a story about that. There's an anthology that I quite like, or it's actually a series of anthologies that came out in 1995, the first ones, called Poems for the Millennium. So, written as 2000 was approaching, is edited by some poets named Jerome Rothenberg and Pierre Jory. And it was an attempt to think about certain strands of experimental or socially aware poetries in a history that was more global and open to different kinds of influences than a Norton anthology might do. Mm-hmm. Nothing necessarily against a Norton anthology, but just presenting a different kind of argument in this anthology. And it's really fabulous and lovely, and there's lots of great stuff in it. But, when it came time to decide what to do about the wasteland, they have a page where the wasteland should be, and the title is in brackets, and the quote where the poem normally would go says, "Much anthologized, Eliot's poem is easily available in the Complete Poems and Plays of T.S. Eliot and in many representative anthologies of American modernism." And then there's a little bit of commentary, like there is after all the selections, talking a bit about how even though Eliot was kind of very conservative, we shouldn't let that cloud our view as to what he actually did contribute. So there's tension, like they're feeling tension about like, this is somebody who in many ways is deeply conservative, is not nearly as experimental as he's normally presented in the normal anthologies, in the normal classroom, and yet is important, and yet at this time was not out of copyright, and it was incredibly expensive for them to get the rights to it. I think I remember an interview in which one of the editors said that it basically would have cost them as much as the rights for everything else in the book to get the wasteland, because that's T.S. Eliot and his estate, very much with their mind on their money. But I find that like a really interesting opportunity to not include it here. You know this poem if you're coming to this anthology. Like, this is not the anthology you would most likely first encounter the wasteland in.
Yeah, you don't need to say it. It doesn't need to be there for you to include it.
Exactly. And so it is literally bracketed, like acknowledging it, but also encouraging you to think of what the history of 20th century poetics looks like if you don't centralize it.
That's very cool.
I think it's a lovely move. Well, that's a little story about this 100-year-old poem that still has a few charms to it. At some point, maybe we'll do some of the other modernist poems around it.
I would love to do Pound sometime. I mean, he's a weird character and like dicey, to say the least, but a lot of interesting things to say about him.
Yeah, absolutely. Or at the very least, include him in an episode about World War I poetries or something like that.
Yeah, that would be neat.
But yeah, he is very interesting. And then there, as that anthology I just described says, there's lots of other cool people around that time period that are worth checking out as well.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there's another poet who is worth checking out, who we will be looking at in our next episode, which, as always, is our end of the year episode in which we remember somebody who passed in this year. And not too long ago now, the poet Bernadette Mayer passed away. And, it's very sad. She'd been sick. It was not a surprise that she passed, but it is still a great loss to us, especially those of us who got to know her and work with her. You might remember that I described taking a class with her a long time ago, but a class with her in New York, which is where I got to meet Samuel Delany. Her work is really lovely, and there's a lot of it. And I like to gobble it all up when I can. And we're going to look, I think, at one of her most celebrated works, a book-length poem called Midwinter Day.
I'm really looking forward to it.
I hope you enjoy it. It's very much, it's allegedly written entirely on Midwinter Day, written over the course of the one day. It describes what happens over the course of the day. And it's a really interesting, very domestic book and in a very appealing way, while also doing some interesting things poetically. So we'll talk more about that next time. But until then, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're still on Twitter somehow at the Spouter. We'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for things that we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/62, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So until next time.
See you again at the Spouter-Inn.